Good evening to the night owls. Good afternoon to the day walkers. And good morning to the rising dead. Welcome to Classified Culture. If you enjoy science fiction and horror stories, then you've come to the right channel. Our goal is to provide quality and original stories for listeners on a regular basis. Every day there will be at least one or two new stories for your listening pleasure. Help this channel grow as a community. You can help by sharing this video, giving it a like, leaving a message in the comments section, and subscribing to the channel. Your feedback and support is always appreciated. Well, I suppose that's enough said for now. It's time for me to do what you all have been waiting for. It's time to let the words I speak guide your imagination with a dark and twisted tale. Victor Wren sat hunched over his radio set, fingers dancing absently across switches and dials as he listened to the crackle of static, waiting for a voice to emerge from the ether. His small cluttered cabin was bathed in the glow of a single bare bulb, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with each creak of the old timbers. The walls were lined with shelves groaning under the weight of dusty books, yellowed maps, and an assortment of antiquated communication devices, remnants of his pastime, his obsession even, since the disappearance of his sister, Lenora. The message had come in as a burst of garbled noise, barely intelligible amidst the usual white noise symphony, but it was enough to catch Victor's attention, to prickle at the back of his neck with that familiar, dreadful sense of déjà vu. Lake Blackwood, unresolved, Lenora. Those were the words that echoed in his mind, as he replayed the recording over and over, until the syllables became little more than meaningless sounds, worn smooth by repetition. He knew that lake well, had spent countless summers there with Lenora when they were children. Their parents had owned a small cottage on its shore, before everything changed, before Lenora vanished without a trace, leaving behind only her bicycle and an eerie calm that seemed to settle over the water like a shroud. Victor had been just 13 when she disappeared. He remembered the search parties, the desperate days spent calling her name into the dense forest surrounding the lake, and the nights filled with terrified waiting as his parents fell apart around him. He remembered, too, the strange occurrences, the sudden violent storms that seemed to blow in from nowhere, the eerie whispers carried on the wind, the fleeting glimpses of something vast and dark moving beneath the surface of the water. And he remembered the day they found Lenora's bicycle, its tires still spinning slowly in the breeze, as if it had only just been abandoned. That was the last time anyone saw her. There were no leads, no clues, nothing but an empty lake and a silent forest. The police eventually gave up, declaring it an unsolvable mystery. But Victor never could. He stood abruptly, knocking over a half-empty mug of cold coffee in his haste to gather supplies for the journey ahead. He knew he had to go back to Lake Blackwood, had to find some answers, no matter how terrible they might be. He was driven by more than just curiosity or sentimentality. It was a compulsion that had grown stronger with each passing year, fueled by the faint hope that perhaps Lenora was still out there somewhere, waiting for him. As he packed his Jeep with gear, tents, sleeping bags, food, water, and an assortment of communication devices, Victor couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced around at the dense trees surrounding his property, their branches bare against the gray sky, like skeletal fingers reaching out for him. A shiver ran down his spine, but he pressed on, determined to leave as soon as possible. The drive took longer than Victor remembered. The roads were narrower, more twisted, and seemed to vanish entirely at times, leading him deeper into the forest than he cared to go. He half expected to find his Jeep blocked by a fallen tree or washed away in a sudden flood, but neither happened. Instead, he arrived at the edge of Lake Blackwood just as the first light of dawn was beginning to break through the clouds. The lake seemed smaller now, its waters less inviting than they had been in Victor's memories. The cottage where they'd spent their summers stood derelict, its once bright blue paint faded and peeling, its windows staring blankly like empty eye sockets. He could almost hear Lenora laughing as she splashed him with water from the dock, could almost feel her small hand slipping into his as they walked through the woods together. But those memories were overshadowed by darker ones. The sound of her bicycle tires spinning slowly in the breeze, the feel of cold rain on his face as he called out her name, the crushing realization that she was truly gone. Victor set up camp quickly, pitching his tent near the shore and building a small fire to ward off the chill that seemed to seep into his bones from the very air around him. He ate a meal of canned beans and dried fruit, barely tasting it as his thoughts raced ahead, anticipating what he might find at Lake Blackwood. As night fell, Victor settled himself inside his tent with his radio set, tuning in to the frequencies he'd used as a teenager. The static was thick here, heavier than it had been back home, but after several minutes of adjusting dials and fiddling with knobs, Victor heard something else amidst the noise, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. He listened intently, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum roll. The tapping came again, steady and measured, almost like fingers rapping against wood. Victor's breath caught in his throat as he realized that the sound was coming from inside the walls of his tent. He reached out a trembling hand, pressing it flat against the fabric, feeling the vibrations of something moving on the other side. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. In its place came a low, wet, dragging noise, like flesh being pulled slowly across rough stone. Victor felt bile-unease in his throat as he imagined what might be causing such a sound. Some creature caught inside the walls, perhaps struggling to escape, or something worse. He stumbled out of the tent, leaving the radio set behind, and stood frozen under the cold light of the moon, listening as the dragging noise continued. It seemed to be coming from all around him now, echoing through the trees like a chorus of twisted whispers. Victor knew he should run, should get as far away from Lake Blackwood as possible before whatever was out there found him, but his feet refused to move, rooted to the spot by terror and some darker fascination. He couldn't tear his gaze away from the water's edge, where shadows seemed to writhe and twist beneath the surface, threatening to break free at any moment. Then, suddenly, everything went still. The dragging noise stopped abruptly, leaving only the distant hoot of an owl to fill the silence. Victor let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his body slackening with relief even as his mind screamed at him to run. And then, without warning, the ground beneath his feet began to tremble. It started as a faint vibration, barely noticeable, but grew steadily stronger until it felt like the very earth was shaking apart around him. Trees groaned and swayed, their roots buckling under the strain. The water of Lake Blackwood churned violently, sending waves crashing against the shore. Victor staggered back, struggling to maintain his footing as the world seemed to come apart at the seams. He caught sight of something moving beneath the water, a vast dark shape that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. It was coming closer, rising steadily towards the surface, and Victor knew with a cold certainty that whatever it was, it had finally found him. He turned to run, but Victor stumbled back to his tent, his heart still racing from the earth's sudden trembling. He knew he should pack up and leave Lake Blackwood, but something held him there, a grim determination born of desperation and dread. He needed to know what had happened to Lenora, even if it cost him his sanity or worse. He unzipped the tent flap and ducked inside, his eyes scanning the dim interior for any sign of disturbance. The radio set lay where he'd left it, its green glow casting eerie shadows on the canvas walls. As he reached out to turn it off, Victor noticed something odd about his hand. Dirt was packed beneath his fingernails, so deep and dark that it seemed like it had been there for days rather than hours. He frowned, trying to remember when he might have gotten so dirty, but his mind drew a blank. It must have happened during his panicked flight from the shore, he reasoned, though he couldn't recall scraping his hands against the ground or digging into the earth with his fingers. Shaking his head, Victor decided not to dwell on it. There were more pressing concerns at hand. He turned off the radio and began packing his supplies back into the car, moving methodically despite the lingering sense of unease that gnawed at him like a physical hunger. As he worked, he found himself absently picking at the dirt beneath his nails, scraping it out with the tip of his pocket knife until his fingers were clean again. Once everything was loaded into the trunk, Victor stood for a moment, gazing out at the lake and wondering where to begin his search for answers about Lenora. The water lay still now, reflecting the slowly brightening sky like a sheet of polished obsidian, giving no hint of the chaos that had erupted just moments before. Victor turned away from the shore, his gaze falling on the old cabin that stood at the edge of the woods. It was little more than a rotting shell, its once sturdy walls now sagging and warped with age and neglect. But it might still contain valuable information about those who had lived there before, people like Lenora perhaps, or even herself. He approached the cabin cautiously, his boots crunching on the overgrown grass beneath them. The air grew thick with decay as he stepped inside, the scent of rotting wood and musty fabric filling his nostrils, making him wrinkle his nose in disgust. Despite this, there was something else about the smell that gave him pause. A faint note of freshness, like newly cut grass or recently turned earth. It shouldn't be possible, Victor thought, given how long the cabin had stood empty. Yet there it was, underlying the decay and clinging to the back of his throat like an invisible hand. He moved deeper into the cabin, his eyes scanning the dim interior for any sign of habitation. There wasn't much left, just a few rusted cans in one corner, their labels long since peeled away by time and moisture. A moldy mattress pushed up against another wall, its once blue ticking now a sickly shade of green. And a single wooden chair sitting alone in the middle of the room, its legs splayed out like those of some grotesque insect. Victor approached the chair warily, his footsteps echoing softly through the empty room. As he drew closer, he noticed something peculiar about it. Though the rest of the chair was covered in dust and cobwebs, the seat appeared clean, almost polished, as if someone had been sitting there recently. And there, on one of the arms, were several deep gouges, their edges ragged and rough, like they'd been made by fingernails clawing desperately for purchase. Victor reached out a tentative hand, tracing the length of one gouge with his fingertip. It was wide enough to fit Lenora's slender fingers perfectly. He realized with a shiver, recalling how she used to bite at her nails when she was nervous or upset. The thought sent a chill down his spine, and not just because of the cold that seemed to permeate every inch of this forsaken place. He stepped back, turning in a slow circle as he tried to imagine what might have happened here. Had Lenora been held captive within these walls? Had she fought to escape, clawing desperately at the very chair on which she'd been forced to sit? Or worse, had someone else been here with her? Someone who had hurt her, perhaps even killed her? The thought was like a physical blow, stealing the breath from Victor's lungs and leaving him gasping for air. He stumbled back, his eyes scanning the room once more, this time searching for some sign of violence or struggle. But there was nothing. No bloodstains on the floorboards, no signs of forced entry through the boarded-up windows, not even so much as a single discarded item that might have belonged to Lenora. Yet despite the lack of evidence, Victor knew with a certainty that went bone deep, something terrible had happened here. Something that had changed Lenora forever, if she was still alive at all. He turned and fled the cabin, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum roll as he raced back towards his car. He could feel it now, the same creeping dread that had plagued him since first setting foot on Lake Blackwood's shores. It seemed to seep into his very pores, wrapping itself around him like a shroud and threatening to smother him utterly. But even as fear threatened to overwhelm him, Victor knew he couldn't leave. Not until he'd found some trace of Lenora, some sign that she was still out there somewhere, waiting for him to save her from whatever fate had befallen her at this god-forsaken place. With shaking hands, he pulled a flashlight from the glove compartment and switched it on, its beam slicing through the gloom as Victor stepped back towards the lake. He'd start with the shore, he decided, searching for any signs of disturbance or hidden structures beneath the water's surface. Maybe there was a cave system down there, something that might explain why electronic signals seemed to be affected whenever anyone ventured too close. He set off along the shore, his boots sinking into the muddy earth as he moved slowly but steadily towards the water's edge. The sun had risen fully now, casting its golden light across the lake and turning the surface into a shimmering expanse of liquid glass. Yet despite the beauty of it all, Victor felt no sense of peace or tranquility. Instead, he was filled with an almost overwhelming sensation of wrongness. Like something ancient and malevolent had taken root deep within these woods, and was now watching him, waiting for just the right moment to strike. As he reached the water's edge, Victor noticed something strange about the plants growing there. Their leaves were twisted and deformed, as if they'd been exposed to some kind of corrosive agent. He knelt down for a closer look, his heart sinking as he realized that this wasn't merely damage caused by time or neglect. No, these poor specimens had been altered deliberately, their very essence warped and corrupted. And then, without warning, the ground beneath him began to tremble once more. It started gently at first. Victor staggered back, his arms pinwheeling as he struggled to maintain his balance. The tremors grew stronger, the ground beneath him bucking like a wild horse, forcing him to his knees. He clawed at the earth, trying desperately to find purchase, but it was no use. The lake itself seemed alive, writhing and twisting, as if attempting to shake off some unseen burden. The water began to churn, frothing and foaming like an angry beast. A deep, rumbling growl echoed across the surface, sending shivers down Victor's spine. It sounded almost organic, as if something massive and ancient lay coiled beneath the depths, awakening from a long slumber. Fear gripped him then, cold and cloying, threatening to smother him utterly. He wanted nothing more than to flee, to run screaming back towards his car and drive until this godforsaken place was nothing but a distant memory. But even as panic clawed at the edges of his mind, Victor knew he couldn't leave. Not while Lenora might still be out there somewhere, needing his help. With superhuman effort, he forced himself to his feet once more, squinting through the glare of the sun off the water's surface. And that was when he saw it. A dark shape moving beneath the waves, gliding silently towards him like some eldritch leviathan. His heart hammered in his chest as he watched, mesmerized and terrified, as the thing drew ever closer. It seemed to absorb all light, casting an almost physical chill over everything it touched. And then, without warning, it surfaced. Victor stumbled back, a hoarse cry tearing itself from his throat as he beheld the creature fully revealed. It was roughly humanoid in shape, but there any resemblance ended. Its skin was slick and black, like obsidian left too long beneath the sun. The eyes were twin pools of darkness, while the mouth yawned wide, filled with row upon row of needle-like teeth. But it was the thing's appendages that truly horrified him. Instead of arms or legs, it possessed writhing tendrils, each one capped with a razor-sharp barb. They lashed and coiled through the air, dripping viscous fluid onto the ground below as the creature continued its inexorable advance. Victor turned to run, but it was already too late. One of those awful tendrils had wrapped itself around his ankle, pulling him off balance even as it tightened like a noose. He fell heavily, the breath forced from his lungs in a single, painful gasp. Panic surged through him then, raw and visceral, threatening to overwhelm all rational thought. He thrashed desperately, clawing at the ground with his fingers, searching for anything that might help him break free. But it was no use. The tendril only tightened further, cutting deep into his flesh until blood flowed freely down his leg. And then, suddenly, everything went still. The creature's movements ceased abruptly, as if some unseen hand had reached out and frozen it mid-motion. The world seemed to hold its breath for a moment, waiting, anticipating something terrible yet to come. Victor dared not move, barely even breathing lest he draw the thing's attention once more. He lay there, panting and terrified, as seconds ticked by like hours. Then, slowly, deliberately, one of the creature's tendrils began to uncoil from around his ankle. It lifted itself off his leg, revealing a deep gash that wept blood onto the ground below. But even as relief surged through him at this small mercy, Victor felt something else. A strange sensation deep within his core, like worms writhing beneath his skin. He tried to dismiss it as merely another symptom of his terror, but it refused to be ignored. Instead, it grew stronger with each passing moment, spreading outwards until every fiber of his being seemed alive with squirming, pulsating energy. Then, without warning, the creature began to change. Its body contorted and shifted, tendrils merging and splitting like some obscene parody of mitosis. The transformation was slow at first, but quickly gained speed until Victor could scarcely follow the thing's movements. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped once more. Before him now stood a figure that was almost human. Almost. It possessed 2 legs, 2 arms, and even something approximating a head, yet there was nothing remotely natural about its appearance. Its skin hung loose and sagging from its bones, like an ill-fitting suit, while its eyes burned with an unsettling inner light. And then there were the teeth. Oh God, those teeth. Victor felt bile rise in his throat as he beheld that awful grin. Each tooth was filed into a sharp point, glinting wickedly in the sunlight. This thing had once been human, he realized with growing horror. It had once walked among them, laughed and loved and lived, just like any other person. And now it was something else entirely. The creature took a step towards him then, moving stiffly, jerkily, as if its limbs were made of wood rather than flesh and blood. Yet despite this unnatural gait, there was no mistaking the menace behind each movement. This thing was hunting him, stalking him like prey, and it would not rest until it had claimed his life. Victor struggled to push himself backwards, away from that terrible gaze, but his limbs refused to cooperate. It was as if some unseen force held him in place, paralyzing him utterly, so he could do nothing but watch helplessly as the creature drew ever closer. And then suddenly, it reached out one twisted hand and laid it gently upon Victor's chest. He flinched away instinctively, but there was nowhere for him to go. Already, he felt that awful sensation of writhing energy deep within his core once more, growing stronger with each passing second. He wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but no sound would come forth. Instead, he could only lie there, trapped and helpless, as the creature leaned in close until its face was mere inches from his own. Its breath was hot and rank upon his skin, reeking of decay and something else. Something familiar. And then Victor realized what it was. The same strange scent that had filled the old cabin by the lake shore. Fresh and unmistakable, despite all those years of neglect. The knowledge sent a shiver down his spine, cold and cloying as fear threatened to overwhelm him once more. But even as panic clawed at the edges of his mind, Victor found himself drawn inexorably towards those terrible eyes, trapped in their gaze like a fly caught in amber. He felt it then, that awful sensation deep within his core growing stronger still, expanding outwards until every fiber of his being seemed alive with writhing, pulsating energy. It was as if something were pushing its way up from inside him, fighting to break free and claim his flesh as its own. And suddenly, Victor knew. Whatever had happened here at Lake Blackwood, whoever, or whatever, had taken Lenora all those years ago, it was now inside him too. He screamed then. Victor's scream echoed through the cabin, raw and primal, before being swallowed by the night. His body convulsed as he felt something writhe beneath his skin, stretching taut like a drum tightened hide. He gagged on bile, eyes wide with terror as he watched his hands twitch uncontrollably, fingers splaying wide before curling into claws. The wet dragging sounds in the wall seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if whatever caused them was now aware of Victor's distress. Each scrape and slide sent a fresh jolt of panic surging through him, setting his heart pounding against his ribcage like a trapped animal. He stumbled away from the creature, half crawling, half falling until he reached the far wall. There he huddled, knees drawn up to his chest, eyes darting wildly around the room. The cabin seemed different now, warped by his fear to something alien and threatening. Every shadow seemed alive with menace, every creak of timber a harbinger of doom. The creature stood motionless where it had been when Victor fled, its gaze still locked onto him. Or so it seemed. In truth, he couldn't be sure if those dark pools could even see him anymore. But still, he felt their weight, heavy and oppressive upon his soul. His breath came in ragged gasps, each inhalation filled with the stench of decay, the same foul odor that permeated the old cabin by the lake's shore all those years ago. It was as if that ancient smell had followed him here, clinging to him like a shroud, tainting every breath he took. Time seemed to slow then, each second stretching out into eternity, as Victor waited for whatever was coming next. His mind raced, desperate for some way out of this nightmare, but all paths led only to terror and death. Then, without warning, the creature moved. Its limbs twitched spasmodically, like a marionette controlled by an unseen hand, before it began to lurch towards him once more. But this time there was no mistaking its purpose. It was coming for him, relentless as a tide, and there was nowhere left for Victor to run. He pressed himself back against the wall, eyes squeezed shut, as if that could somehow shield him from what was to come. But when he opened them again moments later, the creature had changed. Its skin seemed even darker now, almost black in the dim light, stretched so tight over its features that it looked ready to split at any moment. And then Victor saw why. Beneath that taut surface, something moved, a writhing mass of tendrils and limbs, pushing outwards with terrible force until they burst through the skin like roots breaking ground. They were covered in glistening mucus, dripping onto the floorboards with wet plops, each one jerking and spasming as if alive. The sight made bile rise in Victor's throat again, but before he could react, one of those writhing appendages shot out towards him. It wrapped around his wrist like a living rope, pulling him away from the wall with such sudden force that he cried out in pain. He thrashed and struggled against its grip, desperate to free himself, but it was no use. Already he could feel more tendrils snaking up his arm, exploring his flesh with cold alien curiosity. Their touch made his skin crawl, sending waves of revulsion coursing through him, yet still they came on, insinuating themselves into every crevice and fold, until Victor felt utterly consumed by their invasive presence. Then, without warning, they stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, inexorably, Victor began to rise from the floor, held aloft by those unseen tendrils, as if he weighed no more than a feather. Panic surged within him once more, filling his mind with screaming chaos. But still, he could do nothing except hang there limply, utterly helpless in the creature's grip. And then it started to pull him closer, drawing him ever nearer, until its face was mere inches from his own once more. Its breath washed over him, hot and putrid, carrying with it a scent that made Victor's stomach roll. The same strange odor he had first noticed on the wind when he arrived at Lake Blackwood all those years ago. It was the smell of decay, yes, but also something else. Something ancient, primal, and terrifyingly familiar. And suddenly he knew why. It was the scent of Lenora. The realization hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs as shock and horror warred within him. No, it couldn't be, could it? But even as denial screamed through his mind, Victor felt something else begin to change deep within his core. That awful sensation of writhing energy grew stronger still, filling every fiber of his being, until he felt ready to burst apart at the seams. Then, with a final surge of power, it broke free. Victor's body convulsed violently as something erupted from within him, tearing its way out through his mouth and eyes and nose. He screamed again, high and shrill now, like an animal caught in a trap, but there was no escape. Already, he felt himself changing, transforming into something else entirely. His skin began to darken, stretching tight over his features until it looked ready to split at any moment. Beneath that taut surface, tendrils writhed and twisted, pushing outwards with terrible force until they burst through the skin like roots breaking ground. And still Victor screamed, trapped within his own body as it betrayed him utterly, consumed by an ancient horror that would not be denied. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The tendrils froze mid-movement. The writhing energy within him seemed to pause. And for one brief moment, Victor felt a sense of calm, almost peace, wash over him. And then he heard it, a soft, wet sound from somewhere nearby. It was faint at first, barely audible above his own ragged breathing, but growing louder with each passing second until there could be no mistaking its source. It came from the walls. The dragging sounds began anew, louder now, more insistent, echoing through the cabin like a macabre symphony played by some unseen orchestra. Each scrape and slide sent fresh waves of terror surging through Victor's body, setting his heart pounding against his ribcage like a drum beat, marking out the rhythm of his own impending doom. And then, with a final echoing scrape, something burst through the wall directly beside him. A rotted hand emerged first, nails torn and packed with dirt, followed by an arm, and then another, and another still, until finally a whole body came pushing its way out into the room. It was Lenora. Or at least it had once been her. Now she was something else entirely. Her skin was dark and slick, stretched tight over features that seemed both human and not quite so, like a twisted parody of life's cruel joke. Those eyes, those terrible eyes, they were empty now, blank voids that stared out at nothing with an eerie, unblinking intensity. Yet despite Victor's breath hitched in his throat as he stared at the grotesque parody of Lenora that stood before him. Her body twitched and trembled, like a puppet controlled by unseen strings, even after she had fully emerged from the wall. Those empty eyes seemed to bore into him, accusing him somehow, though he knew not why. He felt a sudden urge to flee, but his limbs refused to cooperate. They felt heavy, weighted down by some unseen force that held him rooted to the spot. His heart hammered against his ribcage like a trapped animal desperate for escape, yet still, he could not move. The creature, Lenora, though Victor struggled to reconcile this monstrosity with the girl she once was, began to sway gently from side to side, its movements almost hypnotic in their rhythm. Its hands twitched spasmodically at its sides, claws clicking against one another like bony castanets. Suddenly, it lunged forward, closing the distance between them in an instant. Victor flinched back, but there was nowhere for him to go. He was already pressed up against the wall, his back flush with the cold stone. He braced himself for impact, expecting to feel those razor-sharp claws tear into his flesh at any moment. But instead of attacking, the creature merely stopped inches from him, its face tilted downwards so that its blank gaze fell upon his chest. It remained there like that for what felt like an eternity, utterly still, except for the occasional twitch or spasm that seemed to run through it like some terrible electrical current. Then, with no warning whatsoever, it spoke. "Victor," it rasped, its voice a dry, rattling sound like dead leaves scraping across concrete. "You should not have come back." He recoiled at the sound of his name passing those desiccated lips, feeling a shiver run down his spine that had nothing to do with the chill of the cabin. This thing knew him. It had been waiting for him. How did you know my name?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The creature tilted its head slightly, as if considering this question carefully before answering. "I know many things," it said finally, "things best left forgotten." And then, without another word, it turned and began to walk away, moving with an unnatural grace despite the rotted state of its flesh. Victor watched in horrified fascination as it crossed the room, its movements almost fluid, like water flowing across a flat surface. As it reached the doorway leading out into the hallway beyond, it paused for just a moment, glancing back over its shoulder at him with those empty eyes. Then, it spoke once more. "Come find me, Victor," it said softly. "I have so much to show you." And with that, it disappeared into the darkness, leaving nothing but silence and the lingering stench of decay behind. Victor stood there for a long time after its departure, too stunned even to move. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what had just happened, but no matter how hard he struggled, no explanation seemed capable of encompassing such horror. Gradually, his shock gave way to anger. Angry at himself for coming back here, angry at whatever force had driven him to do so, and above all else, angry at this thing that called itself Lenora. How dare it speak her name? How dare it profane her memory so utterly? He would find it, he vowed silently. He would confront it once more and demand answers, not just for himself, but also for the others who had vanished without trace around this god-forsaken lake. And if those answers were not forthcoming, well, then perhaps something else might be demanded in their stead. With renewed determination burning within him like a flame, Victor set off after the creature, following it deeper into the heart of darkness that lay at the core of this rotted old cabin. The hallway stretched out before him like some twisted funhouse reflection of his own memories. The walls seemed to close in around him as he moved along its length, their surfaces damp and slimy beneath his trembling fingertips. He half expected them to begin writhing again at any moment, those terrible tendrils bursting forth once more to ensnare him in their chilling embrace. Instead, however, it was the floor that betrayed him first. One moment he was walking steadily forward. The next his foot slipped on something slick and wet, sending him crashing down onto his hands and knees with a cry of surprise and pain. He looked back to see what had caused his fall and wished instantly that he hadn't. There, smeared across the rotted floorboards, were several long, dark streaks that seemed almost deliberately arranged into some kind of pattern or design. As Victor watched in horror, those streaks began to move, shifting and twisting like living things, as they coalesced together until they formed a single perfect shape, an arrow pointing directly towards one of the cabin's many doors. An invitation? A summons? Or perhaps simply a mockery? Victor didn't know, nor did he care. All that mattered now was finding out what lay behind that door, no matter how terrible the truth might prove to be. He forced himself back onto his feet, ignoring the pain in his palms where they'd been scraped raw against the floor. Then, with a deep breath that did nothing to steady his nerves, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room beyond was small, little more than a closet really, but it seemed almost impossibly large given its contents. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with shelves, upon which sat row upon row of glass jars filled with things. At first glance, they appeared to be merely curiosities. Strange rocks, twisted roots, even what looked like an entire bird's nest. But as Victor stepped closer, he realized that there was something more to them than mere oddities. Each jar seemed to pulse with some unseen energy, their contents writhing and twisting within the confines of their glass prisons. But it was not these strange artifacts that caught his eye, nor even the faint sense of power they emanated. Rather, it was what hung suspended in midair at the very center of the room. Another jar, this one filled not with some exotic trinket, but instead containing a single, perfectly preserved fingernail. And not just any fingernail. Victor recognized it instantly as belonging to Lenora herself. He had seen her hands countless times during their childhood together, remembered how she would bite at those nails nervously whenever she was deep in thought about something or other. He reached out tentatively towards the jar, his fingers brushing against its cool surface as he turned it gently this way and that, examining its contents more closely. And then he noticed something else. Packed tightly around the base of Lenora's nail were several others, nails just like hers, each one torn violently from some unseen hand. A chill ran down Victor's spine at the sight of them, a cold realization beginning to form in his mind. If these were indeed Lenora's nails, and he had no reason to doubt it, then where was she now? And what had happened to her? Before he could ponder these questions further, however, Victor's breath fogged up the glass as he peered closer at the nails, his heart pounding in his chest like a distant drumbeat. The room was cold, far colder than it had any right to be given its age and disuse. It felt as if the very air was frozen in time, preserving the decay that should have long since taken hold. The smell was another thing entirely. Despite the room having been sealed away for who knew how many decades, it didn't carry that musty odor of long-forgotten spaces. Instead, it was fresh, almost crisp, like something had recently disturbed it, like whatever had been trapped inside had only just begun to rot. A shiver ran down Victor's spine, and not just from the cold. He felt an unease settling over him, a gnawing sense of dread that seemed to seep into his bone. This wasn't right. None of this was right. And yet, he couldn't turn away. Not now, not when he was so close to understanding what had happened to Lenora. He took a step back from the jar, his eyes scanning the rest of the room once more. There were other things here, other artifacts that seemed out of place amidst the decaying furniture and faded wallpaper. A pile of old clothing lay crumpled in one corner, its fabric still damp despite there being no sign of water anywhere nearby. And there, hanging on a hook by the door, was what appeared to be an antique radio, but one whose tubes were cracked and leaking some unknown substance. Victor approached it cautiously, his footsteps echoing hollowly through the small space. He reached out tentatively towards the radio, his fingers brushing against its cold metal casing. It felt wrong somehow, like touching something that shouldn't exist, or perhaps shouldn't be touched. But before he could pull away, a sudden noise caught his attention, a soft, wet, dragging sound coming from somewhere beneath him. He froze, his heart leaping into his throat as he listened intently. There it was again. Thump. Scrape. Drag. Whatever was making that noise was large, heavy, and moving slowly, but deliberately across the floorboards below, and it was getting closer. Victor backed away from the radio, his eyes darting around the room, desperately searching for some means of escape. But there was none. Only the one door he'd entered through, and no windows to speak of. He was trapped here with whatever was making that sound. Trapped with it until it chose to reveal itself or leave him be. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, his breath coming in short gasps as he strained to hear over the pounding of blood in his ears. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. Everything went silent once more except for Victor's own ragged breathing and the frantic beating of his heart. And then, without warning, something moved beneath him. The floorboards groaned underfoot, as if something heavy was shifting position directly below where he stood. Then, with a suddenness that made him jump back in shock, one of the boards bowed upwards, its wood creaking ominously as it began to split apart along its length. Victor stumbled backwards, his arms flailing wildly as he tried to maintain his balance. But there was no use. He felt himself falling, tumbling downwards into whatever darkness lay beneath the rotting floorboards. And then, everything went black. When Victor came to, he found himself lying on his back amidst a pile of damp debris, his head throbbing from where it had struck something hard during his fall. He groaned softly, raising one hand tentatively to his forehead and feeling for any signs of injury. His fingers came away sticky with blood, but it didn't seem too deep, just enough to sting like hell. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, blinking away the spots dancing before his eyes as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. He was no longer in the closet-like room upstairs. Instead, he appeared to be lying in some kind of cavernous space, one filled with strange sounds and even stranger smells. The air here was thick with humidity, heavy with the scent of rotting earth and something else. Something metallic, almost acrid. And there were noises too, wet, sucking sounds that seemed to echo all around him, accompanied by the occasional splash or slither as if something large moved through water nearby. Victor shuddered at the thought, his mind flashing back unwillingly to the sight of Lenora's bloated corpse emerging from the wallpaper upstairs. What if whatever had done that was down here too? What if it was waiting for him right now, hidden amongst the shadows? He reached into his pocket, fumbling for the small flashlight he always carried with him when exploring abandoned places like this one. Its beam cut through the darkness like a blade, illuminating the rough-hewn walls and low ceiling of what appeared to be some kind of natural tunnel. But there was something else too. Something pale and gleaming, just visible beneath the water's surface mere feet away from where Victor lay. He crawled closer cautiously, his breath catching in his throat as he realized what it was. A human arm, its skin stretched taut over changing features, like a glove skin peeled back to reveal something monstrous underneath. Victor felt bile raise in his throat at the sight of it, his stomach churning at the realization that whatever this thing was, it had once been human. Or perhaps not. Perhaps it had always been something else entirely, hiding amongst their midst until now. He reached out tentatively towards the arm, his fingers brushing against its cold flesh, just as a sudden movement caught his eye further downstream. Something large and serpentine seemed to be writhing through the water, its body undulating like liquid metal beneath the surface. And then it turned towards him, revealing a face that was all too familiar. Lenora Tokse. Or at least, something wearing her likeness. Her eyes were milky white, her mouth stretched wide in a silent scream as if frozen mid-howl forevermore. But worst of all were the teeth, those rows upon rows of needle-sharp fangs filling her once human jaw, until there was nothing left but hunger and horror. Victor scrambled backwards away from it, his heart hammering wildly in his chest as panic threatened to overwhelm him completely. This wasn't possible. Lenora couldn't be down here, not like this. Not alive again after all these years gone by. But even as he thought it, he knew deep down that there was no other explanation for what lay before him now. Whatever had taken her all those years ago had kept her preserved somehow, brought her back from the dead to serve some twisted purpose of its own. And now she was here, moving through the water towards him with a terrible grace, her eyes locked onto his as if she could see right through him, as if she knew exactly who he was and what he'd come looking for. Victor tried to stand, but his legs refused to cooperate, rooted firmly in place by terror alone. He watched helplessly as Lenora drew closer still, close enough now that he could make out the individual lines etched into her flesh, each one glowing softly like a vein of gold running through marble. He reached out towards her, imploring. Victor lay there, paralyzed by horror and disbelief. Lenora's face, twisted into a silent scream, seemed to float closer with each wave of the underground river. His mind raced, trying to make sense of this impossible thing, but all he could grasp was the icy terror that gripped his heart like a vice. Suddenly, Lenora's arm twitched. Just a slight movement, but it sent a jolt through Victor's body as if he'd touched a live wire. The flesh was taut over bones that seemed to shift beneath the surface, like something alive and writhing underneath. He felt bile rise in his throat again, but there was nothing left to expel. Then her other arm moved too, reaching out towards him with those terrible teeth bared in what might have been an attempt at a smile. Victor finally strength to scramble backwards, away from that grotesque parody of humanity. His hand slipped on the wet stone floor, and he fell hard against something solid. Another body? Another remnant of whatever had happened down here? He didn't dare look too closely. Instead, he pushed himself up, his breath coming in ragged gasps now, each inhale burning like acid in his lungs. He needed to get out of there, away from Lenora and whatever else might be lurking in the darkness. But when he turned to run, Victor realized that the tunnel had changed. The walls seemed closer somehow, pressing in around him with a damp, heavy pressure. And the dragging sound was louder too, echoing through the passage like a chorus of whispered curses. He stumbled forward, his flashlight beam flickering wildly over the walls. They were slick with something wet and shiny, like oil or blood. He reached out to touch it, his fingers coming away sticky and red. It wasn't just any blood though. It seemed almost alive under his fingertips, pulsing gently as if beating in time with some unseen heart. Victor shuddered and wiped his hand on his pants, trying not to think about what that meant. Instead, he focused on the sound of running water up ahead. If he could just make it there, maybe he could follow the river back out to the lake. Maybe he could still escape this nightmare. But as he approached the source of the noise, Victor found something else blocking his path. It looked like a makeshift dam, constructed from rotting wood and debris, and bones. Human bones, picked clean by time and whatever had built this monstrous barrier. He hesitated, knowing that climbing over it would mean touching those remains, desecrating them somehow. But what choice did he have? He couldn't go back the way he'd come. Lenora was behind him somewhere, her silent scream echoing through the darkness like a haunting melody. So Victor climbed, his hands slipping on damp bone as he pulled himself up and over the dam. The water cascaded around him, cold and aggressive, threatening to pull him under. But he fought against it, pushing forward until he finally emerged into a vast cavern, illuminated by a faint, eerie light. Here, the river widened and slowed, pooling in a massive underground lake before disappearing beneath another wall of stone. And there, bobbing gently on the surface of that stagnant water, was something that made Victor's blood run cold: a boat. It was old and rotted, its timbers barely holding together anymore, but it was big enough for 2 people, maybe even 3 if they sat close together. And as Victor approached, he saw that there were oars too, resting neatly across the thwarts where they'd been left all these years ago. He didn't want to think about who might have rowed out into this godforsaken place and why. All he knew was that he had no choice but to use it if he wanted any hope of escaping alive. So he pushed the boat out onto the water, stepped in cautiously, and began to row towards the distant glow ahead. As he moved away from the shore, Victor felt an inexplicable sense of unease wash over him. It was as if something had shifted deep beneath the surface, some ancient equilibrium disrupted by his presence here. And then he heard it again, that wet dragging sound, louder now than ever before, echoing through the cavern like 1,000 whispering voices raised in anger or hunger or both. Victor rowed faster, desperation lending strength to his arms as he fought against the current. But no matter how hard he pushed himself, he couldn't outrun that sound. It seemed to follow him everywhere, growing louder still, until it was all he could hear above the pounding of his own heart. And then, suddenly, it stopped. Just like that, as if some unseen hand had reached out and silenced it forevermore. Victor paused, listening intently for any sign of its return. But there was nothing save the gentle lapping of water against the sides of the boat. He let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and wiped sweat from his brow. Whatever that thing had been, whatever ancient horror haunted these depths, perhaps it wasn't following him after all. Maybe, just maybe, he could still make it out alive. That's when he heard the splash. It was loud, sudden, and close. Too close for comfort. Victor spun around just in time to see something massive break the surface of the water mere feet behind him. It was dark and amorphous, like a shadow given form, and it seemed to writhe with an otherworldly grace as it moved through the water towards him. He froze, terror rooting him firmly in place once more. This wasn't Lenora. This thing was different somehow, older maybe, far more terrifying than anything his mind could comprehend. And then it surfaced again, revealing rows upon rows of teeth that seemed to fill its entire mouth like some grotesque parody of a whale's baleen. Victor felt bile rise in his throat once more, but there was no time for nausea now. He had to move, had to get away from this monstrous thing before it was too late. So he turned and rowed with all his might, pouring every ounce of strength into each stroke as he fought against the current. But the creature was fast, far faster than anything should be capable of moving through water so thick and heavy. It caught up to him easily, its body undulating like liquid metal as it rose out of the depths beside the boat. Victor could feel its breath now, hot and fetid against his cheek, could see those terrible teeth glinting in the faint light. He braced himself for impact, expecting to be pulled under at any moment. But instead, something unexpected happened. The creature spoke. Its voice was like nothing Victor had ever heard before, a wet, gurgling sound that seemed to resonate deep within his bones rather than passing through his ears alone. And yet somehow, he understood it perfectly, each syllable etched into his mind with crystal clarity. "Why did you come here?" it asked, its eyes burning into him like twin furnaces. "Why disturb what has long been sleeping?" Victor opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. What could he say? That he'd followed a ghost story from his past? That he'd wanted to? Victor rode harder, driven by a primal urge to survive. The creature's words echoed in his mind, but he couldn't afford to dwell on them now. He had to focus on putting distance between himself and that monstrous thing, even as his arms began to burn with exhaustion. The boat sliced through the water, carving a path of disturbed silence behind it. Victor dared not look back. He could feel the creature's presence, its malevolent gaze boring into him like a physical weight. He rode until his breath came in ragged gasps, until his heart threatened to explode within his chest. And then, suddenly, the tension in the air shifted. The oppressive silence was broken by a new sound, the distant echo of water dripping onto stone. Victor risked a glance over his shoulder and saw that he'd entered another cavernous space, this one even larger than the last. The water here seemed shallower too, lapping against what appeared to be a makeshift dock made from rotting timbers and bone. Victor steered towards it, his mind racing with thoughts of escape. If he could just reach that dock, maybe he could find some way out of this underground labyrinth, back up into the world above where sunlight still existed. But as he approached, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A set of footprints leading away from the water's edge, heading deeper into the darkness. They were large, misshapen things, like those of some monstrous beast, and they were fresh, too fresh to have been made by anything other than whatever had been pursuing him. His hope flickered and died like a snuffed-out candle flame. He knew then that there would be no escape for him. Not today, not ever. This ancient horror was far too clever, too patient, too utterly terrifying to let its prey simply slip away. But even so, Victor couldn't bring himself to give up completely. Not yet, not while there was still breath left in his body, still strength in his limbs. So he rode on, following the path laid out by those terrible footprints, until finally they led him to a narrow tunnel carved into the cavern wall. Here, at last, was something familiar. The unmistakable scent of decay, damp and cloying, filling his nostrils as he stepped cautiously onto dry land once more. It was like walking through a grave that had been freshly dug, or perhaps reopened after decades of being left undisturbed. The air felt thick with it, heavy with the weight of long-buried secrets. Victor moved deeper into the tunnel, his footsteps echoing loudly in the oppressive silence. He could see now why the scent of decay was so strong. This place was littered with bones, piled high like some macabre cairn. Human bones, he realized with a shiver, recognizing the shape of them even in their bleached state. And then, suddenly, the tunnel opened up before him, revealing a small chamber filled with an eerie green light. It took Victor a moment to understand what he was looking at, and when he did, his stomach threatened to rebel once more. The walls were covered in something that looked like mold, but wasn't. It pulsed gently with a sickly glow, casting long shadows across the room as it breathed slowly, rhythmically, like some grotesque parody of life. And suspended within it, held aloft by countless thin strands of whatever substance made up this terrible organism, were more bodies. These ones were still fleshy, their skin stretched too tightly over changing features, as if they'd been preserved in some state of agonizing transformation. Their limbs twitched unnaturally, fingers clawing at the empty air, as though trying desperately to escape their prison. But it was the sight of one face in particular that made Victor's heart freeze within his chest. Miriam. Wesley's wife, presumed dead these past 20 years, her eyes wide and staring, her mouth open in a silent scream of terror. He stumbled forward, reaching out towards her even as his mind screamed at him to run, to flee this place while he still could. But it was too late. The moment his fingers brushed against her cold flesh, something shifted behind him. A wet, dragging sound echoed through the chamber, filling Victor with a dread so profound it threatened to crush him entirely. He turned slowly, already knowing what he would find. The creature from the cavern, its body writhing with an otherworldly grace as it moved towards him once more. But this time, there was no fight left in Victor. No strength, no courage, only a bone-deep terror that rendered him utterly paralyzed. He could do nothing but stand there, watching helplessly as the monster drew closer, its rows upon rows of teeth glinting in the sickly green light. "Why did you come here?" it asked again, its voice like liquid evil pouring into his ears. "Why disturb what has long been sleeping?" Victor opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could he say? That he'd followed a ghost story from his past? That he'd wanted to prove himself, to be the hero who solved the mystery once and for all? But there was no heroism here, only fear and desperation, and the cold, hard truth of what awaited him in this place. He had come seeking answers, but instead he found only more questions, more horror than any man could ever hope to bear. And so, as the creature loomed closer still, his breath hot against his cheek, Victor Wren did the only thing left for him to do. He screamed. But even that, it seemed, was not enough. For no sooner had the sound left his lips than the walls themselves seemed to come alive, the pulsing mold shifting and changing until it formed a face with eyes like twin furnaces burning deep into Victor's soul. "Why did you come here?" it whispered, its voice echoing through every inch of this ancient cavern, filling him completely. Why disturb what has long been sleeping? And then, finally, Victor understood. He had made a terrible mistake. He should never have come here, should never have sought out the truth behind Wesley's disappearance all those years ago. For now, it was too late. Now, there would be no escape for him. For in this place of darkness and decay, Victor Wren had found something far worse than death. He had found the embodiment of eternal torment itself. And as the creature moved closer still, its teeth sinking deep into his flesh, Victor knew with absolute certainty that rescue would never come. Not for him, not ever again. In the damp chill of the cellar, Victor huddled close to Miriam, their shared breaths misting in the gloom. Her grip on his arm was feverish, nails digging into flesh as if trying to anchor herself to the world above. The stench was overwhelming, like a tomb freshly opened after decades, filling his nostrils and coating his tongue with decay. The walls around them seemed to throb with an ancient malevolence, the pulsating mold shifting and changing until it formed faces, countless faces pressed against the stone, eyes burning into Victor's soul. He couldn't tell if they were real or just more tricks of this cruel place, but he felt their presence nonetheless, a physical weight pressing down on him, threatening to crush his sanity. "You shouldn't have come here," Miriam whispered, her voice ragged and broken. "None of us should have." Victor said nothing, only held her closer, feeling the tremors racking her body. He knew she was right, but it didn't change anything now. They were here, trapped in this nightmare, and escape seemed further away than ever. The dragging sound echoed again, louder this time, reverberating through the chamber like a slow, steady heartbeat. Victor felt it resonate within him too, his own heart pounding wildly as panic threatened to consume him whole. Then came a noise that turned his blood cold, fingernails scraping against stone, sharp and rhythmic, like some grotesque parody of music. It was coming from above them, the ceiling of the cellar shaking with each scrape. Miriam's grip tightened on Victor's arm, her breath catching in her throat as she too listened to that terrible symphony. It's changing," she choked out, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. "Whatever it is, it's changing up there." Victor knew she was right. He could feel it too, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, an increasing pressure pushing down on them from every side. And then, Without warning, the scraping stopped. Silence. For a moment, Victor dared to hope that perhaps this time it would pass them by, leave them alone in their darkness. But then came a new sound. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing down through the chamber above. It was coming. Victor braced himself, every fiber of his being screaming at him to run, to fight, to do something, anything. But he knew there was nowhere left to go. They were trapped here, just like all those poor souls who had come before them. The footsteps grew louder, closer, each one shaking the very foundations of the cellar until Victor felt sure the whole place would crumble around them. And then, finally, they stopped, right above their heads. A soft, wet sound filled the air, like something heavy being dragged across a slick surface. Then came a noise that sent icy tendrils of fear writhing down Victor's spine. The sound of stone grinding against stone, growing louder and faster until it reached a fever pitch, then stopped abruptly. Something was coming through the ceiling. Victor looked up just as a section of the stone gave way, crashing down in a shower of debris. And there, framed by the ragged hole, was the creature they had fled from all those years ago. Its eyes burned like twin furnaces, casting sickly green shadows over their trembling forms. But something was different this time. The creature seemed changed. Its body writhed with an otherworldly grace, bones snapping and reforming as it moved towards them, rows upon rows of teeth glinting in the dim light. And there, hanging limp from its grasp, was a figure Victor recognized all too well, Iris. Her eyes were closed, her skin pale and waxy, but she seemed whole, unharmed, as if sleep had simply claimed her while standing right there in that very spot. The creature tossed Iris's body to the floor with a sickening thud, then turned its gaze back on Victor and Miriam. "Choose," it commanded, its voice echoing through every inch of the chamber, filling them completely. "One of you will leave this place alive. The other will remain here forever." Victor felt Miriam trembling beside him, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she clutched at his arm. He looked down at her, then back up at the creature looming above them. This was it, their final moment, their last chance for escape. But how could he choose? How could he sentence one of them to this eternal torment while saving himself? I can't," Victor stammered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of blood in his ears. "I won't." The creature seemed to smile, its rows upon rows of teeth glinting menacingly in the gloom. "Then I choose for you," it said, and lunged. Victor threw himself aside, pushing Miriam out of the way just in time to avoid being crushed beneath the creature's wrath. He hit the ground hard, pain exploding along his side as he rolled away from its snapping jaws, drawing Miriam with him. But there was no escaping this thing. It seemed to anticipate their every move, cutting off their retreat at every turn. They were trapped, cornered like animals awaiting the slaughterhouse knife. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The creature stood tall above them, regarding them with those burning eyes, as if waiting for something or someone. Miriam looked up at Victor, confusion etched deep into her features. "What's happening?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over their ragged breaths. Before Victor could answer, a figure stepped out of the shadows behind them. It was Lenora, her eyes wide with terror, but her stance defiant as she faced down the monster before them. "No," she said, her voice steady despite the tremors racking her body. "You will not take any more of us." The creature seemed amused by this display of bravado, tilting its head to one side as it regarded Lenora with obvious interest. "And how do you propose to stop me?" it asked, its voice like liquid evil pouring into their ears. Lenora didn't answer. Instead, she stepped forward, placing herself between Victor and Miriam on one. As Lenora stepped forward, her defiance seemed to embolden Miriam. She broke away from Victor's grasp and stood beside Lenora, facing down their ancient tormentor together. But Victor hesitated, frozen in place as he watched the two women he cared about, most prepared to sacrifice themselves for him. The creature chuckled, a sound like wet rocks grinding against one another. "Brave," it said, licking its lips with a tongue that seemed far too long and serpentine, but foolish. It lunged at them, moving faster than anything Victor had ever seen. Miriam and Lenora threw themselves to the side, but they weren't fast enough. The creature's claws raked across Lenora's back, tearing through fabric and flesh alike with sickening ease. Blood splattered against the stone walls, painting them red in the dim light. Lenora screamed, a sound that seemed torn from the very depths of her soul. She stumbled forward, falling to her knees as she clutched at her ruined back. Miriam was there instantly, cradling Lenora in her arms and pressing her hands against the wounds, trying desperately to stem the flow of blood. Victor finally broke free from his paralysis, rushing towards them with tears stinging his eyes. But it was too late. The creature had already moved on, its burning gaze now fixed solely upon him. "Now," it said, its voice like thunder in Victor's ears, "it is just you and me." Victor backed away, feeling the cold stone wall at his back as he realized there was nowhere left to run. He could hear Miriam crying softly behind him, Lenora's ragged breathing growing ever more shallow with each passing moment. And then, suddenly, a new sound filled the chamber. The wet dragging noise from earlier, only now it seemed even louder, closer somehow. It echoed through every inch of the cellar, filling Victor's mind completely as he tried to pinpoint its source. But before he could, something moved in the darkness above them. The ceiling began to sag and buckle, great chunks of stone and mortar raining down upon them as a massive shape struggled free from its ancient prison. Victor watched in horror as it emerged, a creature unlike anything he had ever seen or imagined, its form shifting and changing, even as it hung there before him, suspended from the ruined ceiling by countless roots that seemed to writhe like snakes beneath its skin. Its body was massive, bloated with centuries of decay and corruption. Skin stretched too tightly over features that seemed almost human but were twisted into something far more alien and horrifying. And its eyes burned like twin furnaces, boring into Victor's very soul as if seeking to consume him whole. "This is what you sought," it said, its voice like distant thunder rumbling through the chamber. "This is what you wanted to see." Victor could only stare, his mind racing, but finding no escape from the horror before him. He knew now that they had never stood a chance against such an ancient evil, that their presence here had been nothing more than a fleeting annoyance for this creature. And then, suddenly, it moved. The massive form dropped down from the ceiling with sickening speed, landing heavily upon the stone floor, mere yards away from where Victor stood frozen in terror. Miriam screamed behind him, Lenora's ragged breaths now little more than desperate gasps for air. Victor knew he had to do something. He couldn't just stand there and let them all be consumed by this ancient horror. But what could he possibly do against such a thing? As if reading his thoughts, the creature spoke again. "Choose," it said, its voice now little more than a low growl deep in its throat. "Choose who will live and who will die." Victor looked back at Miriam, saw the fear etched into every line of her face as she clutched Lenora's lifeless body to her chest. He knew then that there was no way out for them, no escape from this cellar or the ancient evil that dwelt within it. And so, with a heavy heart, Victor made his choice. He turned back towards the creature, stepping forward until he stood between it and Miriam. "Me," he said, his voice steady despite the terror gripping his very soul. "I choose me." The creature seemed to smile at this, its rows upon rows of teeth glinting menacingly in the gloom. "A wise choice," it said, and lunged. Victor stood his ground, closing his eyes as he braced himself for the inevitable impact. But instead of pain, he felt something else, a sudden overwhelming sensation of cold, as if he had been plunged into an icy lake. And then, just like that, everything went black. When Victor opened his eyes again, he found himself lying on the shore of the lake, the sun casting its first light upon the water's surface. He sat up slowly, his body aching and covered in bruises as if he had been through some terrible ordeal. But there was no sign of the cellar, or Miriam, or Lenora, or the creature. It was as if they had never existed at all. Victor stood on shaky legs, looking out across the lake towards the distant horizon, where dawn was beginning to break. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with cool morning air, and turned back towards the path that led up from the shore. As he walked, he noticed something strange. There were no footprints in the dew-kissed grass behind him. No sign whatsoever that anyone had ever been there but him. He reached the top of the hill and paused for a moment, looking back one last time at the lake below. Then, with a heavy heart, he turned away and began to walk towards the house. But as he approached, he realized something was wrong. The front door stood open, swinging gently in the breeze, and there were no lights on inside, despite the early hour. Victor stepped into the hallway, his footsteps echoing through the empty house like gunshots. "Miriam," he called out softly, hope already fading from his voice. No answer came except for the distant ticking of a clock somewhere deep within the house's bowels. Victor moved deeper into the house, searching each room in turn but finding nothing but emptiness and dust. Until he reached the attic. The door was closed, but not latched. It creaked open slowly under his touch, revealing a room filled with shadows and memories. And there, sitting on an old rocking chair by the window, was Miriam. She didn't turn as he entered, her gaze fixed firmly upon something outside that only she could see. Victor approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. "Miriam," he whispered, barely able to force the word past his lips. Still, she didn't move, didn't respond. It was as if she hadn't heard him at all. Victor reached out tentatively, placing a hand on her shoulder. And that's when he saw it, the long, jagged scar running across her back where Lenora had once stood, defiant against their ancient tormentor. A cold chill ran down Victor's spine as realization dawned upon him. He looked out through the window at whatever held Miriam's gaze so completely, and there, standing alone on the shore of the lake beneath the rising sun, was himself. The wrong person had survived. In that moment, Victor understood. He hadn't escaped their ancient tormentor after all. It had merely set him free, trapping him within his own mind where he would be forced to live out eternity with the knowledge of what he had done, who he had become. And so, as Miriam continued to rock gently back and forth in her chair, Victor turned away from the window and walked silently out of the room, leaving her to her endless vigil while he wandered alone through the echoing halls of their empty house.